It's virtually impossible to miss these days on the media the violence that took place in Paris a couple of days ago. ISIS claimed responsibility for the deaths of many Parisians, and these deaths are being reported from various angles, the impact of them, the tragedy of them. But as a result of this, what's happened is there is obviously a negative and a very intense negative attitude towards many Muslims, and particularly ISIS. The people in Paris who suffered deaths are seen as victims of an extreme form of the Islamic tradition, and there has, as a result of this, increasingly so, and of course from 9/11 forward, been this attitude towards many Muslims. Europe and North America in the last 15 years have seen increasingly so an encounter between Islam and Western civilization. But has this occurred before, or is this something new? And how have Christians responded to their encounter with Islam? The Reformation was a very fascinating period of time, and most people, when they think of the 16th century, mostly think of the Protestant critique of the Roman Catholic tradition and the role of Luther, Calvin, the Anabaptists, the Baptists, Quakers. And so in the read of that 16th century, people become excessively focused on the Reformation, Roman Catholicism, and that preoccupies their time and attention. But there's another backstory going on at this time also. In 1453, Constantinople fell under the Turks, or the Muslims, and as a result of that, Eastern Christendom began to collapse, and there was a strong reaction against Islam, no different than today. The Muslims were coming in through Eastern Europe. They in fact were attacking Vienna, and they were on their way into Western Europe. They were also coming up through the south, the Mediterranean, and it looked like, in fact, Europe was going to be overrun by Muslims. And so the very attitude many of us have today towards Islam, ISIS, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, was very, very much mirrored by what was going on in the 16th century. So what was the various reactions then to Christians in the 16th century to the threat of Islam about to invade, take over Christendom as it was known? Well, one reaction is the reaction we get today, the hawkish response. Violence has been done to us, Constantinople is down, Paris has been attacked, 9/11, you respond, violence for violence. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So this is the hawkish response. Is that the only way, in fact, to respond to the threat of Islam? Well, Erasmus of Rotterdam was writing at this time also, and his argument was that, in fact, there are reasons for the fall of Constantinople. There are reasons for the collapse of what seems to be Christendom. It was because Christians themselves had been irresponsible in terms of living together as a people, and God was using the Muslims, as it were, to correct, to rebuke Christendom. In that sense, he was turning to the Old Testament narrative of how God used the Assyrians, the Medes and Persians, the Macedonians to deal with the Jews. And so Erasmus argued, one, that Christians should be much more sensitive to Muslims. How is God using them to correct the many aberrations within Christendom itself? And he urged people not to respond in a hawkish manner, but in terms of an ironical manner to the Muslim community. So 16th century, 21st century, Paris, Europe, how are Christians to respond to Islam? Well, there were different voices at work in the 16th century, and there are different voices at work today. And perhaps with some turning of our ear to Erasmus rather than to hawkish tradition, or a deeper interpretive read in terms of what's going on, we might be able to learn much from how the doves of the 16th century responded, and how can we respond today to what are seen as the threats of Islam, and have different options than just eye for eye, tooth for tooth, gun for gun reaction. But there's perhaps a much deeper dynamic at work in terms of a challenge of Western civilization, and perhaps its internal fragmentation, and how Islam is taking advantage of that, and how Christians can respond in a much more ironical, peaceful way without resorting to reactionary violence. And Erasmus of Rotterdam is a fascinating way to look at how Christians could potentially respond in a more dovish manner. Situations are exactly the same. 21st century, Paris, 9/11, Islam, 16th century, fall of Constantinople, threat of Muslims. Parallels are exactly the same. How did the 16th century respond? Can it act as a model to how the 21st century can respond? This is why we essential to understand Christian history, because it gives us leads, models, perspectives, and diverse ways of reacting, in this case, to what is seen as the Islamic threat. And Erasmus was at the forefront of saying, rather than reacting to Islam, Christians have to have a much deeper sense of introspection, of analyzing their own faults in what is going on, rather than idealizing their own civilization and demonizing the Islamic tradition.